Welcome, dear sleepyheads, to the greenwood deep. Tonight we journey not to distant battlefields or foreign courts, but to the heart of England itself, to the ancient forests of Sherwood, where oak trees older than memory stretched their branches toward heaven, and where the line between legend and history blurs like morning mist over the River Trent. This is the tale of Robin Hood, whose very name has echoed through 8 centuries as both hero and villain, rebel and thief, defender of the poor and enemy of the rich. But before we venture into those shadowed glades where outlaws made their home, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through the folklore and fragments of history. If these wanderings through England's storied past bring you comfort, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps me share more tales from the chronicles of old. Now, close your eyes and let us step quietly into the world of 12th century England to meet the archer who would become immortal. In the year of our Lord 1189, as autumn painted the English forests in shades of gold and crimson, a nation held its breath. King Richard, called Lionheart for his courage, had departed for the Holy Land, leaving his kingdom in the hands of his younger brother, John. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic for thousands of ordinary Englishmen, and transformative for the legend we call Robin Hood. Picture, if you will, the England of that time. It was a land still bleeding from the wounds of conquest, where Norman lords ruled over Saxon peasants with an iron fist encased in a mailed glove. 123 years had passed since William the Conqueror had crossed the Channel, but the division between conqueror and conquered remained as sharp as a freshly honed blade. The great forests of England, Sherwood in Nottinghamshire, Barnesdale in Yorkshire, the New Forest in Hampshire, were no longer the common lands where Saxon freemen had hunted for generations. They had become the private playgrounds of Norman nobility, protected by forest law so harsh that a man could lose his eyes for killing a deer, his hands for taking a hare, his life for resisting the foresters who enforced these cruel statutes. Nottingham itself was a study in contrasts. The castle, built by William Peveril soon after the conquest, loomed over the town like a stone fist, its sandstone walls rising from the rocky outcrop that commanded the crossing of the River Leen. Within its walls lived the Norman elite, knights in their mail hauberks, ladies in their imported silks, clerks who recorded the grinding taxation that kept the common folk perpetually on the edge of starvation. Below the castle, in the cramped streets of the town, lived another world entirely. Saxon merchants who had learned to speak Norman French to survive, craftsmen whose guilds dated back centuries, but who now paid fees to Norman overlords for the privilege of practicing their trades. Farmers who came to market to sell what little surplus the tax collectors had left them. The Sheriff of Nottingham, and there was indeed such an office, though the man who held it changed from reign to reign, was the king's representative in the shire, responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and enforcing the hated forest law. In the absence of a strong king, such men could become petty tyrants, enriching themselves while claiming to serve the crown. The forest law was particularly despised. In Saxon times, the forests had been commons where any freeman could hunt, gather wood, graze pigs on the autumn acorns. The Normans had declared vast stretches of woodland to be royal forest, reserved for the king's pleasure. To take a deer was no longer feeding your family. It was poaching the king's venison, a crime that could cost you everything. The foresters who patrolled these woods were equally hated. They were often Englishmen themselves, Saxons who had made their accommodation with Norman power, and this made them even more despised than the Norman lords they served. They would lurk in the greenwood, watching for the telltale signs of poaching, a snare set for rabbits, a deer carcass being dressed, even a peasant with bow and arrows within the forest bounds. But the forests were vast, and the foresters were few. And in those endless acres of oak and ash, beech and birch, there was room for men who chose to live outside the law. Outlaws, they were called, literally outside the law's protection, fair game for anyone who wished to kill them. But in the reign of bad King John, when law itself seemed to serve only the powerful, being outside the law began to look like freedom. It was into this world of oppression and resistance, of Norman cruelty and Saxon endurance, of royal forests and royal tyranny, that our story's hero emerged. Whether he was a nobleman dispossessed, a yeoman farmer driven to desperation, or simply a skilled archer who refused to bow to injustice, the man we call Robin Hood was about to step from the shadows of history into the eternal sunlight of legend. The stage was set. The players were gathering. In Nottingham Castle, the sheriff plotted his taxes and his power. In the villages surrounding Sherwood, Saxon folk whispered of resistance, and somewhere in the depths of the greenwood, where sunlight filtered through leaves in cathedral-like beams, a movement was beginning that would become the most enduring legend of English folklore. Who was Robin Hood? The question has no single answer, for he was many things to many people. But perhaps in the end he was something simpler and more profound. He was the eternal dream of the oppressed, the fantasy that somewhere, someone was fighting back, that the poor might triumph over the rich, that justice might prevail over law, that in the deep woods freedom still survived. The ancient oaks of Sherwood had seen generations come and go. They would witness one more, the age of the outlaw, the time of Robin Hood, the days when Lincoln Green became the colour of defiance, and the English longbow became the weapon of the people's champion. The earliest stories of Robin Hood tell us almost nothing about his origins, as if he simply materialized from the forest itself, fully formed, already legendary. But men do not become outlaws without cause, and legends do not spring from nothing. So let us imagine, based on the fragments that survive in ballad and chronicle, how a man might become the outlaw of Sherwood. In the village of Locksley, or perhaps Locksley, in the year 1189 or thereabouts, there lived a young man whose skill with the longbow was already becoming notable. The longbow was not yet the weapon that would make English archers feared across Europe. That development was still decades away. But among hunters and foresters, among men who needed to bring down deer or defend their homes, the bow was already recognized as the weapon of the skilled and patient. Robert of Locksley, if that was indeed his name, and the historicity is so murky we cannot be certain, was by some accounts a yeoman, a freeman who held his land by service rather than by noble birth. This places him in that interesting middle ground of medieval society, neither noble nor peasant, with enough status to have something to lose and enough freedom to make choices about his fate. The England Robert knew was changing rapidly and terribly. King Richard, the Lionheart, had departed for the Third Crusade in 1190, leaving his kingdom in the hands of his younger brother John and his chancellor, William Longchamp. The cost of Richard's crusade was astronomical. It required ransoms, taxes, the sale of offices and privileges. "I would sell London if I could find a buyer," Richard reportedly joked, and his administrators seemed to take him at his word. The taxation was crushing. The Saladin tithe, 10% of all movable property, had already stripped many families of their reserves. Now came additional levies to pay for the crusade, to fund Richard's ransom when he was captured on his return journey, to maintain the armies needed to defend his French territories. For wealthy nobles, these were inconveniences. For common folk, they were catastrophes. But it was not taxation alone that created outlaws. It was the law itself, particularly the forest law, that turned ancient rights into capital crimes. The story goes, and every version tells it differently, that Robert encountered the foresters in Sherwood, that words were exchanged, that violence erupted. Perhaps he was hunting deer to feed his family during a hard winter. Perhaps he was defending others who were being harassed. Perhaps, as some ballads suggest, he killed a forester in self-defense or in defense of his companions. What matters is not the specific incident, but its consequence. In medieval England, to kill a forester, even in self-defense, was a crime that left no room for mercy. The foresters were the king's men, and to harm them was to harm the king himself. Robert would have been declared outlaw, his lands forfeit, his life forfeit, and anyone who saw him could kill him with legal impunity. But here is where the story takes its crucial turn, the moment when one man's personal tragedy becomes the seed of legend. Rather than fleeing England entirely, rather than submitting to justice that was no justice at all, Robert chose a third path. He went into the forest, not as a cowering fugitive, but as a free man, and he invited others to join him. The men who gathered around him in those early days were a mixed lot, as desperate and various as outlawry itself. There was John, called Little John in that medieval sense of humour that gave nicknames opposite to their bearers, a giant of a man, 7 feet tall according to some accounts, who had his own grievance against Norman law. There was Much the miller's son, a common man who had lost his mill to taxation and his freedom to debt. There was Will Scarlet, whose name might have been Scathlock or Scarlet, a fierce fighter with his own history of resisting authority. And there was Allan a Dale, the minstrel, whose songs would help spread Robin's fame far beyond Sherwood's borders. In medieval society, minstrels were the mass media, carrying news and entertainment from manor to manor, festival to fair. A man who had a minstrel in his band had a way to shape his own legend. Later stories would add Friar Tuck, that fighting monk who supposedly lived in Fountain Dale and who represented the church's better angels, the clergy who sided with the poor against the wealthy prelates who squeezed them. Whether such a man actually existed matters less than what he represents. The idea that even religious authority could be bent to serve justice rather than power. These men, and others whose names are lost to history, created something new in Sherwood Forest. They were not merely bandits, though they certainly robbed those who travelled through the greenwood. They were not simple outlaws fleeing justice, though outlaws they legally were. They were becoming something else, a community, a brotherhood, a force that stood for the old Saxon values of fairness and freedom against the Norman values of law and power. The forest itself became their cathedral, their castle, their kingdom. In the depths of Sherwood, among the ancient oaks, they built camps that could shelter dozens of men. They learned every game trail, every hidden dell, every ford across the streams that wound through the woodland. They could disappear like deer when danger approached, then materialize like ghosts to strike at travellers who seemed to have the forest to themselves. But Robin and his men did not rob indiscriminately. This is crucial to understanding how they became heroes rather than villains. The ballads are clear on this point. They robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. They let poor travellers pass unmolested, sometimes even giving them money for their journey. They stopped bishops and abbots who were carrying church revenues extorted from impoverished parishes. They waylaid tax collectors carrying the king's revenues that had been wrung from starving farmers. Was this historical fact? Almost certainly not in every detail. But the ballads reflect a deeper truth, that Robin and his men saw themselves not as criminals, but as executors of a higher justice. The law said that taking the king's deer was theft. Robin's moral code said that letting children starve while deer ran free was the real crime. The law said that taxes must be paid regardless of hardship. Robin's code said that taking a widow's last penny was robbery, regardless of who authorized it. This moral dimension transformed Robin from outlaw to hero. He became, in the eyes of the common people, not an enemy of law, but its truest servant, enforcing the law of God and nature that stood above the tyrannical statutes of kings and sheriffs. He became the people's champion, striking back at those who oppressed them, redistributing wealth from those who had too much to those who had nothing. The Sheriff of Nottingham, whose name varies in different versions of the tale, but whose role remains constant, became Robin's particular enemy. This makes psychological and practical sense. The sheriff was the face of royal authority in Nottinghamshire, the man responsible for enforcing the forest law, collecting the taxes, maintaining Norman power. In confronting the sheriff, Robin was confronting the entire system of oppression. Their conflict played out in a series of encounters that blend history, legend, and folklore so thoroughly that separating them is impossible. There was the archery contest that was supposedly a trap to capture Robin, but which he won in disguise, humiliating the sheriff before his own people. There was the rescue of Little John from Nottingham's prison, a daring raid that showed the sheriff was not safe, even in his own stronghold. There were countless ambushes of the sheriff's tax collectors, returning to the poor what had been taken from them. But beyond the specific incidents, what emerged was a pattern of resistance that gave hope to the powerless. Here was proof that Norman might was not invincible, that Saxon cunning could triumph over French armor, that the common man with his longbow could bring down the mounted knight. Every successful raid, every escaped capture, every time Robin appeared in Nottingham to thumb his nose at authority before vanishing back into the greenwood. All of it fed the growing legend. The greenwood itself took on mythic qualities. Sherwood Forest wasn't merely woods, but a parallel kingdom where Saxon values still held sway, where a man's worth was measured by his skill and courage rather than his birth, where the old gods of England perhaps still walked among the oaks. To enter Sherwood was to enter a space outside Norman control, a sanctuary where the oppressed could find refuge and the powerful could find their comeuppance. Robin's band grew. 20 men became 40, 40 became 80. Not all were fighters. There were craftsmen who could fletch arrows, women who cooked and tended the wounded, children who served as lookouts and messengers. The outlaw camp became a village in the forest, a community sustained by robbery, but held together by something more, a shared rejection of injustice, a common dream of freedom. The making of the outlaw was complete. The man who had perhaps been Robert of Locksley had become Robin Hood, the people's hero, the sheriff's nemesis, the king of the greenwood. His transformation from man to legend had begun, and it would continue for 8 centuries, growing with each telling, adapting to each age, but always maintaining its essential core. Here was a man who chose resistance over submission, freedom over safety, justice over law. As the 12th century drew toward its close, as King Richard remained absent on crusade and then in captivity, as bad King John's misrule grew ever more oppressive, the legend of Robin Hood spread throughout England. In manor houses, servants whispered his name. In taverns, common folk raised cups to his health. In churches, priests who were supposed to condemn outlawry found themselves telling stories of a robber who somehow embodied Christian charity better than many a bishop. The forest had found its king. The people had found their champion. The legend had found its beginning. And in the depths of Sherwood, under the spreading branches of the major oak, Robin Hood and his merry men prepared for the adventures that would make them immortal. The oak tree still stands in Sherwood Forest, a massive patriarch of the woodland, its trunk so wide it would take 5 men to encircle it, its branches spreading like the arms of a benevolent giant. They call it the Major Oak now, and tourists come from around the world to photograph it, to touch its ancient bark, to stand in its shade and imagine. Legend says this was Robin Hood's headquarters, that beneath its branches he held court, dispensed justice, planned his raids against Norman tyranny. Is it true? The tree is certainly old enough, perhaps 800 years, perhaps more. Carbon dating and dendrochronology suggest it was already growing in Robin's time, if there was a Robin, and if he lived when the legends place him. But truth and legend intertwine so completely in Sherwood that separating them is both impossible and, perhaps, unnecessary. The tree is real. The legend is real. And somewhere in the space between them lies something true about England, about justice, about resistance. Let us enter that space now. Let us imagine the Greenwood Kingdom at its height, when Robin Hood's name was known throughout England, and his band of outlaws had become a parallel power to that of king and sheriff, operating by different rules, serving a different law. The encampment beneath the oaks was more sophisticated than mere Hollywood romance might suggest. These were not men playing at woodland life. They were professional outlaws who had to survive English winters, maintain weapons and equipment, feed dozens of mouths, and keep watch against enemies who would happily hang them from the nearest tree. The camp was part fortress, part village, part military installation. Lookouts were posted on the major paths through the forest, men who could whistle bird calls that would carry through the woods to warn of approaching travelers. These scouts learned to distinguish the sound of horses from the sound of cattle, could count approaching men by the fall of hoofbeats, could tell from a distance whether travelers were armed and dangerous or wealthy and vulnerable. The main camp was hidden in a dell where the great oaks grew thickest, where a stream provided fresh water and natural cover. Shelters were built not of wood that would require cutting trees and leaving traces, but of bent branches thatched with bracken, nearly invisible from more than a few yards away. In winter, these were supplemented with dugouts, partially underground shelters that stayed warmer than surface structures. Weapons were maintained with a care that would have impressed any knight's armourer. Longbows had to be kept dry and seasoned, bowstrings had to be replaced regularly, arrows had to be fletched and pointed. Each man of Robin's band was expected to maintain his own equipment and contribute to the common armoury. A man whose bow broke in battle or whose arrows were poorly made might cost not only his own life, but the lives of his brothers. The training regimen was constant. Medieval combat, whether with bow or sword or quarterstaff, required strength and skill that could only be maintained through regular practice. Every morning, Robin's men would spend hours in archery practice, shooting at butts, targets made of tightly bound straw, set at varying distances. A good longbowman could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards, and the best could manage feet shots that seem impossible. Splitting a wand, hitting the same arrow twice, shooting accurately while running. But archery was not the only skill. The quarterstaff was the outlaw's close combat weapon of choice, a 6-foot length of seasoned oak, often iron-bound at the ends, that could break bones, crack skulls, and parry sword blows. The famous encounter between Robin and Little John, meeting on a narrow bridge and fighting with staves until Robin was knocked into the water, was not just folklore. It was a demonstration of the weapon that made outlaws effective in close combat without requiring the expensive metal of swords. Food was always a concern. Poaching the king's deer was what had made many of them outlaws in the first place, but it remained their primary source of meat. The does and bucks that roamed Sherwood were not just symbols of royal privilege. They were protein, necessary for men who lived rough and worked hard. The outlaws became expert at silent hunting, taking deer with longbows at close range, butchering them quickly, hiding the evidence. But venison alone could not sustain them. Fishing in the forest streams provided variety. Gathering wild foods, nuts, berries, mushrooms, roots, supplemented their diet. Some accounts mention that sympathetic farmers and villagers on the forest's edge would leave food where the outlaws could find it, a sort of voluntary tax that bought goodwill and perhaps occasional protection from other bandits. The moral economy of Robin's band was clear and, in its way, strictly enforced. They robbed the rich, not just because the rich had more worth taking, but because the rich had gained their wealth through a system the outlaws rejected. Abbots and bishops who rode through the forest with laden pack horses were fair game. for their wealth came from tithes extracted from poor parishioners, merchants who had grown fat on trade while their neighbours starved were targets. Nobles whose lands had been granted by the conqueror, taken from Saxon holders, were robbed on principle. But the poor were sacrosanct. A farmer travelling to market with a pig or a load of grain passed through Sherwood unmolested. A widow carrying her few possessions might find herself instead receiving a gift from the outlaws. Travelling workers, pilgrims, anyone who clearly had little was not just spared, but often aided. This discrimination wasn't just good public relations, it was central to Robin's identity and his band's cohesion. The distribution of the spoils followed rules that, while not written, were understood and respected. Robin, as leader, took no larger share than anyone else. The band's needs came first: new equipment, food stores for lean times, care for the wounded. What remained was divided equally, though men who had taken particular risks might be granted extra. And a significant portion was actively given away to the poor, distributed in villages, left at churches, given to families the outlaws knew were struggling. This last practice, giving to the poor, transformed robbery into something else. It made the outlaws not mere thieves, but redistributors, agents of a rough justice that took from those who had gained through an unjust system and gave to those that system had crushed. It was revolutionary in its implications, suggesting that property rights established by conquest and maintained by law were less legitimate than the natural rights of people to feed their families and live in dignity. The relationship between the outlaws and the surrounding communities was complex. Officially, of course, helping outlaws was a crime. In reality, the line between forest and farmland was permeable. Outlaws had families in the villages, mothers, wives, children who remained in their homes. They had friends who sympathized with their cause. They had informants who warned them of the sheriff's plans, and they had grateful recipients of their charity who felt a debt to the men in Lincoln Green. This network of support made Robin's band nearly impossible to eliminate. The sheriff could send armed forces into Sherwood, and he did, repeatedly. But the outlaws always seemed to know they were coming. They would fade deeper into the forest, or they would set ambushes that turned hunters into prey. Without support from the local population, even a substantial military force was nearly helpless in the vast woodland. The administration of justice within the Greenwood Kingdom was Robin's particular responsibility. He was not a Democrat. The Middle Ages knew nothing of democracy. But he was a leader who listened to his men and ruled by respect rather than fear. Disputes were settled by arbitration, with Robin or his lieutenants hearing both sides. Serious crimes within the band, theft from comrades, betrayal or cowardice, were punished severely, sometimes with banishment, occasionally with death. But the justice Robin dispensed extended beyond his own band. Travellers who were robbed, those rich enough to be legitimate targets, were often subjected to a sort of rough hearing. Robin would ask how they had gained their wealth. If the answer revealed honest work and fair dealing, they might be allowed to keep more than if they were clearly exploiters or corrupt officials. Some stories tell of Robin releasing prisoners he had taken when he discovered they were men of principle despite their wealth. This theatrical quality to Robin's justice, the interrogation of victims, the demonstration that their robbery was itself a form of justice, was crucial to his legend. He was not just stealing, he was making a point. Each robbery was a morality play, demonstrating that the true thieves were those who robbed the poor through legal taxation and lordly privilege. The women of Sherwood Forest appear less frequently in the early ballads, but were clearly present. Maid Marian, who would become central to later versions of the legend, may or may not have existed in the original stories. But women were certainly part of the outlaw community, as companions, as workers, as fighters in some accounts. Medieval life was harsh for everyone, and the notion that women stayed safely at home while men did all the difficult work is a romantic fiction. Outlaw women were as tough as outlaw men, and some stories suggest they were equally skilled with bow and blade. The rhythm of life in the greenwood followed the seasons. Summer was relatively easy. Long days, mild weather, abundant food. Autumn brought the need to prepare for winter, stockpiling food, improving shelters, making and repairing equipment. Winter was hard, with short days, cold that penetrated even the best shelters, and the constant danger of leaving tracks in snow. Spring brought renewal, new growth, and the return of travelers to the roads, which meant new opportunities for the outlaws' particular form of redistribution. Religious observance in the outlaw camp was apparently sincere, despite the band's criminal status. Robin, in all the ballads, is depicted as pious, with particular devotion to the Virgin Mary. This was not hypocrisy. Medieval people saw no contradiction between religious faith and resistance to corrupt authority. Robin may have been robbing bishops, but he believed he was serving God by helping the poor and punishing the greedy. The church itself was divided, with some clergy supporting the outlaws and others condemning them. Friar Tuck, if he existed, represented the best of medieval Christianity, the tradition of Saint Francis, of care for the poor, of critique of ecclesiastical wealth. The fact that an ordained priest would join outlaws says something important about the moral landscape of the time. The church's claim to moral authority was undermined by its bishop's wealth and its willingness to serve temporal power. A friar who chose to serve God in the greenwood, ministering to outlaws and helping the poor, might be closer to Christ's teachings than a bishop in his palace. The Greenwood Kingdom had its festivals too. Despite the hardship of outlaw life, there was room for joy, for celebration, for the assertion of humanity in the face of law and oppression. May Day, that ancient celebration of spring and fertility, was apparently observed by the outlaws with the same enthusiasm as any English village. The stories of Robin Hood became intertwined with the May Games, those folk celebrations, where a man dressed in green represented the spirit of summer contending with winter. This association with pre-Christian folk traditions is significant. Robin Hood was not just resisting Norman law, he was connecting to something older, to Saxon and perhaps even more ancient English traditions. The greenwood was the remnant of the wildwood that had covered Britain before Roman, Saxon, and Norman invasions. In taking refuge there, Robin was reclaiming an England that predated conquest, an England where the land belonged to those who lived on it, rather than to those who claimed it by force. As years passed, and the ballads are vague about chronology, the Greenwood Kingdom became an established fact of life in the Midlands. Travellers through Sherwood Forest knew they might encounter Robin Hood, and if they were wealthy, they took precautions. The poor, by contrast, might seek out the outlaws, bringing information, asking for help, seeking justice that the official courts would not provide. The Sheriff of Nottingham, for his part, became increasingly frustrated and increasingly obsessed with capturing Robin. Every failed expedition into Sherwood, every tax collector robbed, every time Robin appeared in the town itself to mock the authorities before escaping, all of it was a personal affront. The conflict between Robin and the sheriff transcended law enforcement and became a battle of wits, a test of wills, a confrontation between two different visions of justice. In the Greenwood Kingdom, Robin Hood reigned as a kind of anti-king, ruling by consent and respect rather than by force and fear, dispensing a justice that reflected the values of the common people rather than the interests of the powerful, living free in the forest rather than constrained by the walls of castle or town. It could not last forever. Nothing does. But while it lasted, it gave hope to the oppressed and demonstrated that power was not absolute, that resistance was possible, that somewhere in England freedom still survived. The oak trees of Sherwood had witnessed many human stories, many generations of triumph and tragedy. But perhaps none would prove more enduring than the tale they witnessed in the late 12th or early 13th century, the time when the Greenwood was a kingdom, when Lincoln Green was the colour of freedom, and when an outlaw's arrow was the weapon of justice. The winter of 1194 brought an unusual cold to Nottinghamshire, a bone-deep chill that made even the great oaks of Sherwood seem to shiver. In Nottingham Castle, warmed by fires that consumed a cord of wood per day, the sheriff sat in his private chamber and contemplated the problem of Robin Hood with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The sheriff, let us call him William de Wendenal, though the historical record is murky and various men held the office, was not a simple villain. He was a professional administrator, educated in law, experienced in governance, charged with maintaining order and collecting revenue in a volatile shire. His cruelty was not recreational, but instrumental. He crushed dissent because dissent threatened stability. He enforced harsh penalties because mercy might encourage others to break the law. In his own mind, he was a servant of order against chaos, civilization against barbarism. But Robin Hood had made him look foolish, and in medieval society, where authority rested on reputation as much as force, being made to look foolish was dangerous. The sheriff's superiors, first Prince John, then King Richard upon his return from crusade, asked pointed questions about why Nottinghamshire's forests remained infested with outlaws while its tax revenues declined. The sheriff's rivals whispered that he was incompetent, or worse, that he was being bribed to allow the outlaws to operate. Pride and practicality combined to make the capture of Robin Hood the sheriff's primary objective. He had tried force, sending armed expeditions into Sherwood that achieved nothing but losses of men and equipment. He had tried bribes, offering pardons and rewards to anyone who would betray Robin, finding that loyalty among the outlaws was stronger than gold. He had tried legal measures, declaring anyone who aided outlaws to be outlaws themselves, only to discover that terrorizing the populace made them more sympathetic to the bandits, not less. Now he would try cunning. The plan took shape over weeks of consultation with his most trusted advisers. It exploited what the sheriff saw as Robin's fundamental weakness, his vanity about his archery skills. Every report from the forest mentioned Robin's legendary accuracy with the longbow, his ability to perform shots that seemed impossible, his pride in his marksmanship. Pride, the sheriff knew, was the crack through which many great men had fallen. An archery tournament would be announced, to be held on the green outside Nottingham Castle on the Feast of St. George, April 23rd. The prize would be a golden arrow, a treasure worth a small fortune, but more importantly, a symbol of supremacy among archers. Competitors would come from throughout the Midlands, professional hunters, military archers, noblemen's guards, anyone who fancied their skill with a bow. And Robin Hood, the sheriff calculated, would not be able to resist. The proclamation was posted throughout Nottinghamshire and the surrounding counties. Town criers announced it at markets and fairs. The message was carefully crafted, not mentioning Robin Hood specifically, but describing the competition in terms that would appeal to his pride. The finest archers in England would compete. The winner would be declared the champion of all archers. The golden arrow would mark its bearer as the greatest bowman in the realm. In Sherwood Forest, when word of the tournament reached the Outlaw camp, the debate was immediate and fierce. Little John, ever cautious despite his size and strength, argued against attending. "It's a trap, Robin," as obvious as a snare left in plain sight. "The sheriff wants you to come. He'll have soldiers waiting. You'll be captured or killed. And for what? A golden arrow you could buy with a month's takings from the Nottingham road." Will Scarlet agreed. "John's right. Your pride isn't worth your life. Let some other archer win the tournament. What does it matter to us who's declared champion by Norman law?" But Robin, gazing at the tournament notice that had been brought to camp by a sympathetic merchant, felt the pull of temptation. Not just pride, though pride was certainly part of it. There was also the challenge. Could he walk into the sheriff's stronghold, compete under his enemy's eyes, and escape? There was the symbolic value. Winning would be another humiliation for the sheriff, another demonstration that outlaws could do as they pleased. And there was, perhaps, simple boredom with forest life, a desire for action and recognition that drove many young men to foolish deeds. "I'll go," Robin announced, "but not as myself. I'll go in disguise, win the tournament, claim the arrow, and be gone before the sheriff realizes he's been fooled again." The disguise was carefully prepared. Robin's distinctive Lincoln green was replaced with drab brown and russet. His longbow, a weapon known throughout the Shire, was temporarily exchanged for a similar but less distinctive weapon. Most importantly, his appearance was altered. Beard grown out and dyed grey, a theatrical limp adopted, the bearing of a man perhaps 20 years older than his actual age. He would enter as a yeoman archer from Derbyshire, travelling through Nottingham on his way to family business in the south. 3 of his men would accompany him, also in disguise, to watch his back and signal if danger appeared. Little John would stand near the castle gates, positioned to sound an alarm. Will Scarlet would mingle with the crowd, listening for signs that the sheriff's men had identified Robin. Much would hold horses in a tavern stable, ready for a quick escape if needed. The morning of St. George's Day dawned clear and bright, unusual for April in England, as if heaven itself wanted a good view of what would transpire. The green outside Nottingham Castle filled with people, competitors preparing their equipment, spectators taking positions for the best views, merchants selling food and drink, pickpockets working the crowd, and everywhere soldiers in the sheriff's livery, ostensibly to maintain order, but clearly searching for something or someone. The competitors were impressive. There were hunters from the northern forests, men who had won fame tracking deer and boar. There were military archers from castle garrisons, trained in the massed volleys that were beginning to make the English longbow feared across Europe. There were foresters, gamekeepers, and professional hunters, men whose livelihoods depended on their accuracy. Perhaps 70 archers in total, each confident, each skilled, each dreaming of the golden arrow. Robin, in his disguise as an aging yeoman named Robert of Hathersage, registered for the competition with casual indifference, giving his name in an accent he had learned from listening to travellers from Derbyshire. The clerk who recorded his entry barely glanced at him. This brown-clad old man looked like 100 other minor archers who showed up at such events hoping for a lucky day. The format of the competition was traditional. Targets, called butts, were set at increasing distances. All archers shot at the closest target first. Those who missed were eliminated. The survivors moved to the next distance. This continued until only a handful remained for the final challenge, hitting a wand, a slim piece of wood no thicker than a man's thumb, at 100 paces. Robin advanced through the early rounds without drawing attention. He hit the targets accurately, but not spectacularly, keeping himself in the middle of the pack. When archers around him performed impressive shots, drawing applause from the crowd, he applauded with them, playing the part of a solid but unremarkable competitor. The sheriff watched from a raised platform, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Next to him sat his daughter. Some versions of the legend name her Marian, others leave her nameless, a young woman who had grown up hearing about the Outlaw of Sherwood and who watched the archers with an interest that was more than casual. She had asked her father repeatedly why he was so obsessed with capturing one bandit among many. His answers never satisfied her. As the afternoon wore on and the competition narrowed, Robin allowed his true skill to show. At 70 paces, shooting at a mark the size of a man's palm, he placed his arrow dead center. At 80 paces, he split a willow wand on his second shot. The crowd began to notice the old yeoman from Derbyshire, murmuring appreciation for his unexpected accuracy. By the time only 6 archers remained for the final challenge, Robin was among them. The others were renowned shots, a forester from Sherwood itself, bitter irony there, a castle archer from York, a hunter who had once served royalty, and 2 other competitors of unknown background but obvious skill. The final target was set, a willow wand, no thicker than a man's thumb, at 100 paces. Each archer would have 1 shot. The closest to hitting the wand would win. The sheriff, now paying close attention to the proceedings, announced that he himself would judge the shots. The forester went first, his arrow whistling through the air to strike within a hand span of the wand, respectable, but not winning. The York archer did better, his shaft landing close enough to touch the wand's base. The crowd roared approval. The next two archers failed to match this performance, their arrows going wide or falling short. Now only two remained, the hunter who had served royalty and the old yeoman from Derbyshire. The hunter, sensing victory within reach, took his time, settling his breathing, sighting carefully. His arrow flew true, striking the wand itself, but deflecting off rather than embedding. Better than the York archer. This was likely the winning shot. Robin stepped to the mark. The crowd fell silent, sensing something dramatic about to occur. He drew his bow, not hurrying but not delaying either, sighted for what seemed an impossibly brief moment, and released. The arrow flew straight and true, striking the willow wand dead center with such force that it split the thin wood cleanly in two. The silence lasted a heartbeat. Then the crowd erupted in amazement. Such a shot was the stuff of legend. Even the other archers, competitors though they were, cheered the incredible display of skill. The sheriff stood, leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the old yeoman who had just performed what might be the greatest archery shot ever seen in Nottingham. As the golden arrow was brought forward, the sheriff descended from his platform, coming toward Robin with what might have been suspicion or might have been simple desire to congratulate a master archer. This was the moment of greatest danger. Up close, disguise or not, the sheriff might recognize his enemy. But Robin, emboldened by success and perhaps by the simple joy of his achievement, played his role perfectly. He accepted the golden arrow with the surprised gratitude of a man who had hoped to do well, but never expected to win. He thanked the sheriff in his adopted accent, praised the organization of the tournament, and expressed amazement at his own luck. The sheriff, looking closely at this brown-clad yeoman, seemed to sense something, but could not quite identify it. The age was wrong. Robin Hood was a young man, and this was clearly someone older. The bearing was wrong. Robin was said to move with a warrior's grace, and this man limped. Most tellingly, the bow was wrong. Robin Hood's weapon was famous, and this was just an ordinary longbow. Yet something nagged at the sheriff's instincts. He detained Robin with conversation, asking about his background, his training, where he had learned to shoot with such accuracy. Robin spun a tale of learning from his father, of hunting in Derbyshire's hills, of this being his first major competition. All plausible, all delivered with just the right mix of pride and humility. It was the sheriff's daughter who broke the tension. She approached, ostensibly to congratulate the winner, but actually to whisper to her father that he was being rude, that the poor man clearly wanted to celebrate with his companions, that the sheriff's interrogation was making the crowd uncomfortable. The sheriff, recalled to propriety, released Robin with a final suspicious look. Robin made his way through the congratulating crowd, accepting praise, making his way gradually towards the edge of the green where Little John waited. The golden arrow, tucked under his arm, caught the late afternoon sun. He was perhaps 50 paces from the gate, perhaps 30 seconds from escape, when the shout came. "The bow! Look at his bow!" One of the sheriff's men, sharper-eyed than most, had noticed that the old yeoman's bow, ordinary though it appeared, bore a tiny mark carved into the wood, a mark that had been reported by witnesses to Robin Hood robberies. It was a mistake in Robin's preparation, a small detail overlooked. Time seemed to slow. The sheriff's hand went to his sword. Soldiers began pushing through the crowd. Little John's warning whistle pierced the air. Robin dropped his limp, straightened to his full height, and ran. What followed was chaos. The crowd, realizing they had been watching Robin Hood himself, reacted in confusion, some trying to help him escape, others trying to impede him, most simply trying to get out of the way of armed men. Robin sprinted for the gate, the golden arrow still clutched in his hand, his disguise abandoned. He reached the gatehouse just ahead of the pursuing soldiers, but the way was blocked. Castle guards, alerted by the alarm, had begun closing the heavy gates. This was the moment the sheriff had planned for, the trap that would finally catch his enemy. But Little John, that giant of a man, had positioned himself perfectly. As Robin ran through the narrowing gap, Little John caught the closing gate with his massive strength, holding it open just long enough for Robin to pass through, then letting it swing shut in the face of the pursuing guards. The heavy oak portal slammed closed with a boom that could be heard throughout the town. Outside the castle precincts, chaos continued. Will Scarlet and Much had the horses ready, but the narrow streets of Nottingham, crowded with tournament attendees, made quick escape impossible. Robin and his men had to fight their way through, not with swords, killing townspeople would destroy their reputation, but with fists and quarterstaff, breaking through the confusion toward the town gates and the open country beyond. The sheriff's men poured from the castle, mounted cavalry pushing through the crowds, foot soldiers running through alleys seeking to cut off escape routes. The pursuit stretched through Nottingham's winding streets, a running battle that moved from Market Square to residential lanes to the artisans' quarter near the town walls. Robin reached the north gate, thankfully open for legitimate traffic, just ahead of his pursuers. He burst through onto the road that led toward Sherwood, running now with the speed born of desperation, his companions beside him, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. The race to the forest was perhaps the closest Robin ever came to capture. The sheriff's cavalry, freed from the narrow streets, closed the distance with frightening speed. Arrows began to fly, not from Robin, who was running for his life, but from the pursuing archers, hoping for a lucky shot. One shaft came close enough to tear through Robin's sleeve. Another struck Little John's pack, embedding in the supplies he carried. But the forest was close now, the edge of Sherwood visible as a dark line of green across the fields. 200 yards. 100. 50. The cavalry was perhaps 30 seconds behind, close enough that Robin could hear individual voices shouting orders, close enough that he could hear the thunder of hooves on packed earth. They reached the tree line and plunged into the woods. Here, the advantage shifted dramatically. The cavalry had to slow for the undergrowth and low branches. The outlaws, who knew every path and game trail, could move through the forest faster than most men could run on open ground. Within minutes, they had vanished, swallowed by Sherwood as completely as if the forest had opened to take them in and then closed behind them. The sheriff's men searched for hours, pushing deep into the greenwood, but found nothing. Robin and his companions had disappeared like smoke, like dreams, like ghosts. By nightfall, the soldiers returned to Nottingham empty-handed, faces grim with failure. That night, in the great hall of Nottingham Castle, the sheriff sat alone except for a cup of wine that he barely touched. He had come so close. The trap had been well laid. The tournament had worked as designed. Robin Hood had indeed attended. And yet, somehow, impossibly, the outlaw had escaped, taking with him not just his freedom, but the golden arrow. Proof of his victory, another humiliation for the sheriff to endure. In Sherwood Forest, beneath the spreading branches of the major oak, Robin Hood and his merry men celebrated with captured wine and roasted venison. The golden arrow was passed from hand to hand, admired in the firelight, but Robin's thoughts were elsewhere. The close escape had reminded him that his luck would not hold forever. The sheriff was intelligent, dedicated, and had all the resources of the law behind him. Eventually, something would go wrong. But that was a concern for another day. Tonight was for celebration, for the joy of having walked into the enemy's stronghold and walked out triumphant, for the story that would spread throughout England. How Robin Hood had won the sheriff's tournament, claimed the golden arrow, and escaped from under the noses of 100 soldiers. The legend grew that night, fed by the audacious raid, the incredible archery shot, the dramatic escape. By morning, the story would be told in every tavern from York to London, growing with each telling but keeping its essential truth, that Robin Hood had made fools of his enemies again, that courage and skill could triumph over power and numbers, that somewhere in England freedom and justice still survived. The sheriff's gambit had failed, but there would be other gambits, other traps, other attempts. The battle between law and outlaw, between Norman authority and Saxon resistance, between the sheriff and Robin Hood would continue. Neither man would surrender. Neither would compromise. And so the contest would go on, each victory temporary, each defeat survivable, until time itself decided the outcome. The autumn of 1194 brought news to England that changed everything. King Richard, the Lionheart, had returned from captivity. After his crusade to the Holy Land, after his capture by Leopold of Austria on the journey home, after his imprisonment and the payment of an enormous ransom, Richard Plantagenet had finally come back to his kingdom. For Robin Hood and his outlaws, this news carried profound implications. They had never rebelled against Richard. Their resistance had been against the corruption and tyranny of Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham during the king's absence. In ballads and stories, Robin was consistently portrayed as Richard's loyal subject, fighting not to overthrow royal authority, but to preserve it from those who misused it in the king's name. Whether this was historically true or merely a useful fiction is impossible to say at this distance. But it reflected an important truth about medieval resistance. Rebels needed legitimacy, and claiming to act in the name of the rightful king against his corrupt officials was one way to achieve it. Robin Hood was not a revolutionary seeking to overthrow the social order. He was, in his own mind at least, a loyal subject fighting to restore proper authority. The reality of Richard's return was complex. The king was nearly bankrupt. His ransom of 150,000 marks had stripped England of wealth. He was focused on his continental possessions, particularly his wars against Philip II of France. He had little interest in English domestic affairs beyond extracting money to fund his military campaigns, and he had no particular love for the common people, despite the legends that would later portray him as a just and kindly monarch. But legend and reality diverged early in the story of Robin Hood, and nowhere more than in the tale of the king's visit to Sherwood Forest. Whether it actually happened is doubtful. Whether it should have happened in the moral universe of the ballads is certain. And so the story was told and retold, and eventually became as much a part of Robin Hood's legend as the golden arrow or the friendship with Little John. The story goes thus. King Richard, touring his kingdom and hearing constant reports of the Outlaw of Sherwood, decided to investigate for himself. Rather than sending troops or officials, he chose to visit the forest incognito, disguised as an abbot traveling with a small retinue. This allowed him to see the truth of the situation with his own eyes, unfiltered by the reports of sheriffs and nobles who might have their own reasons to distort the facts. The disguise was clever. Abbots travelled frequently between monasteries and often carried significant wealth, making them attractive targets for outlaws. If Robin Hood was truly the selective robber of legend, one who robbed the rich clergy but spared the poor, then an apparent abbot would surely be stopped. And so it happened. As the disguised king's party rode through Sherwood, they were intercepted by men in Lincoln Green who seemed to materialize from the forest itself. Little John, or Will Scarlet, or one of Robin's other lieutenants, stepped into the road, bow in hand, and delivered the traditional challenge. "Stand and deliver, my lords. You travel through Robin Hood's forest, and all who do so must pay for safe passage." The abbot, playing his role, protested that he was a simple cleric, travelling on church business, carrying only what was necessary for his journey. Robin himself appeared, always the dramatic entrance, always aware of the theatrical value of his confrontations. He examined the travellers with the practised eye of a man who had made many such assessments. "Simple cleric, you say?" Robin smiled. "And yet your horses are too fine, your guards too well armed, your manner too confident. I think you are not what you seem, my Lord Abbot. But no matter. We rob not for the pleasure of it, but for the need of it. What you can spare, we will take and give to those who have nothing." The confrontation proceeded according to the outlaw code. The travellers were treated courteously but firmly. Their belongings were examined, and a portion of their gold was taken, enough to hurt, but not enough to leave them destitute. Robin explained, as he always did, that this was not robbery, but redistribution, justice against those who had grown fat while others starved. Then came the crucial moment, the test that would define Robin Hood's character for centuries to come. The disguised king, revealing just enough of his true identity to be recognized, asked Robin a direct question. If King Richard were to return to England, if the rightful king were to reclaim his throne and restore justice, would you cease your outlawry? Would you serve the king as a loyal subject should? Robin's answer, according to legend, was immediate and sincere. "I have never been disloyal to King Richard. Everything I have done in his name, to preserve his justice against those who corrupted it while he was absent. If the king returns and rules justly, I would serve him gladly, even unto death." The king revealed himself, throwing off his disguise, and Robin Hood dropped to his knees, whether in genuine reverence or merely playing the scene as it needed to be played, we cannot know. Richard, impressed by Robin's courage, skill, and claimed loyalty, offered him a pardon. More than that, he offered him a position. Join the royal guard, leave the forest, return to lawful society with all crimes forgiven. This is the moment when the Robin Hood legend reveals its deepest truth. In most versions of the story, Robin accepts the pardon. He and his men leave Sherwood, take service with the king, and enter legitimate society. The outlaw becomes a royal servant. The rebel becomes a loyalist. The forest king becomes a courtier. But there is a melancholy undertone to this resolution, a sense that something is lost in the transition. Robin Hood in the king's service is no longer the free spirit of the greenwood. He is constrained by court protocol, by the demands of royal service, by the very law he once defied. The man who robbed bishops cannot rob them when he serves the king who appointed those bishops. The champion of the poor cannot redistribute wealth when he is part of the system that concentrates that wealth. Some versions of the legend have Robin remaining in royal service for years, fighting in Richard's wars, distinguishing himself in battle, earning honor and reward. He becomes a conventional hero, distinguished by skill and courage, but no longer the revolutionary figure who challenged the social order. This Robin Hood serves the same system he once opposed, the same hierarchy he once defied. Other versions are shorter-lived. Robin finds he cannot adapt to court life. The conspiracy, the politics, the careful diplomacy required of a courtier, all of it is alien to a man who solved problems with his bow and spoke truth regardless of consequence. He grows restless, unhappy, constrained by the very legitimacy he once claimed to seek. And Richard himself, in these versions, proves to be not the just king of legend, but a practical monarch more interested in raising money for his wars than in ensuring justice for his subjects. The taxes continue. The forest law remains harsh. The sheriffs and nobles who oppressed the people during Richard's absence continue to do so with his tacit approval. Robin realizes that the system itself is the problem, not merely its corrupt administrators. In the most poignant versions of the tale, Robin eventually requests permission to return to Sherwood, supposedly for a brief visit, ostensibly to show the king his former domain. Richard grants this, perhaps sensing that his restless servant will never be truly happy at court. Robin rides north toward Nottinghamshire, and with each mile the weight seems to lift from his shoulders. When he reaches the edge of Sherwood Forest, he pauses. Behind him is the court, with its wealth and security and legitimacy. Ahead is the greenwood, with its danger and freedom and outlawry. For a moment he stands balanced between two worlds, two ways of being. Then he spurs his horse forward, plunging into the forest, and doesn't return to the king's service. He has chosen freedom over security, principle over pragmatism, the greenwood over the court. He is outlaw again, by choice this time rather than necessity, because he has learned that some compromises cost too much, that some systems cannot be reformed from within, that sometimes the only moral choice is to remain outside. This version of the story, Robin returning to outlawry even after being pardoned, is perhaps the most subversive. It suggests that the problem is not bad kings or corrupt officials, but the entire structure of feudal society. It implies that true justice cannot exist within a system built on conquest and maintained by oppression. It argues that freedom requires rejecting the very legitimacy that society offers as the price of acceptance. Whether King Richard actually met Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest is almost certainly fictional. Whether Robin Hood even existed as a historical figure is debatable. But the legend of their meeting, and Robin's choice of forest over court, captures something profoundly true about resistance and compromise, about the price of legitimacy and the cost of freedom. The return of the king didn't end the Robin Hood legend. If anything, it deepened it, adding layers of complexity to a story that might otherwise have been simple banditry. Robin became not just a robber, but a figure who chose his values over his comfort, who rejected the easy path of acceptance for the hard path of continued resistance. In Sherwood Forest, whether the historical Sherwood of the 1190s or the mythical Sherwood of eternal legend, the outlaws celebrated their freedom beneath the ancient oaks. They had been offered legitimacy and had found it wanting. They had been promised justice and had discovered it was conditional. They had been invited to serve power and had chosen instead to challenge it. The king returned to his wars in France. The sheriff continued his administration in Nottingham. The nobles maintained their privileges, and in the greenwood, men in Lincoln Green continued to rob the rich and give to the poor, continued to defend those who could not defend themselves, continued to prove that somewhere in England freedom still survived. The golden age of Robin Hood's outlawry, if there ever was such a thing, was perhaps this period after the king's return, when the band operated not from necessity, but from choice, not as fugitives, but as free men who had rejected what society offered because the price was too high. They were outlaws, not because they had to be, but because they chose to be. And that choice made all the difference. Time is the one enemy that even the greatest archer cannot defeat with skill or courage. The years that followed King Richard's return, whether that return involved meeting Robin Hood or not, brought inevitable changes to Sherwood Forest and its outlaws. The constant vigilance, the harsh living conditions, the violence that punctuated periods of relative peace, all of it took its toll on men who were, despite their legendary status, mortal. The ballads are vague about chronology, as folklore often is. Robin Hood might have been an outlaw for 5 years, or 20, might have been a young man throughout his adventures, or might have aged from youth to middle age in the greenwood. But all versions agree that eventually the outlaw of Sherwood faced his final challenges, and that his end came not in glorious battle, but through treachery and decline. The composition of the outlaw band changed over time. Men died in skirmishes with the sheriff's forces from disease, from simple accidents that in the medieval world could be fatal. Others left, accepting pardons, growing too old for the hard life of outlawry, simply disappearing into the vast anonymity of medieval England. And new men joined, bringing fresh energy but also changing the character of the band. Little John, Robin's closest friend and most loyal companion, was one of the constants, but even he grew older. The giant strength that had made him formidable in his youth gradually diminishing. Will Scarlet, Friar Tuck, Much the miller's son, the band of brothers who had defined the early years of Robin's outlawry, grew grey and stiff. The legendary merry men became legendary old men, their merriment more nostalgic than genuine, their adventures more often recalled than created. Robin himself felt the weight of years. The longbow requires tremendous strength to draw, and shoulders that have pulled 100-pound bow thousands of times eventual protest. Eyes that could once split a wand at 100 paces found their focus softening. Reflexes that had saved his life in countless encounters slowed imperceptibly, but unmistakably. More subtly, the psychological toll accumulated. Robin had spent years in constant vigilance, always watching for betrayal, always prepared for violence, always aware that the next traveller through Sherwood might be his last. This is a burden that wears down even the strongest spirit. The joy that had once characterized his outlawry, the satisfaction of striking back at injustice, the pleasure of outwitting the sheriff, gradually gave way to a kind of weary persistence. The political landscape had changed too. King Richard, that absent monarch whose authority Robin had claimed to serve, died in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound suffered while besieging a castle in France. His brother John ascended to the throne, the same John whose misrule during Richard's absence had helped create the conditions for Robin's outlawry. King John's reign was, if anything, even more oppressive than his regency had been. His conflicts with the Pope, his wars in France, his constant need for money to fund his ambitions, all of it meant increased taxation, increased enforcement, increased pressure on the common people. The Sheriff of Nottingham, whether the same man or a successor, had more support than ever for harsh measures against outlaws. Ironically, this should have been Robin Hood's moment. A tyrannical king, oppressive officials, a population ground down by taxation and forest law. These were the conditions that had made him a hero in the first place. But Robin was no longer the young man who had fled to Sherwood years before. The energy for resistance, the optimism that change was possible, the belief that his actions mattered, all of it had been eroded by time and disappointment. There are different versions of Robin Hood's death, each reflecting different understandings of his character and meaning. Some are heroic, some tragic, some almost mundane. But most share certain elements: betrayal, decline, and a return to the fundamental question of justice that had driven his entire outlaw career. The most famous version involves his cousin, the Prioress of Kirklees. In medieval medical practice, bloodletting was considered therapeutic, removing bad blood to restore health and balance. Robin, feeling ill, the nature of his illness varies by version. Some say old wounds reopened, others suggest disease, still others imply simple. Aging, travelled to Kirklees Priory to be bled by the prioress, who was reputed to be skilled in medicine. But the prioress, whether bribed by the sheriff, motivated by her own grievances, or simply believing she was serving justice by eliminating an outlaw, betrayed Robin. Instead of the therapeutic bloodletting he requested, she opened his veins too deeply and then locked him in a room to bleed to death. By the time Robin realized what was happening, he was too weak to escape, too far from help to be rescued. In his final moments, according to legend, Robin managed to blow his horn, that signal that had called his men to his aid so many times. Little John, hearing the call, raced to Kirklees, arriving too late to save his friend, but in time for a final farewell. The scene is one of the most poignant in English folklore. The giant John, who had stood beside Robin through countless adventures, now helpless to prevent his death. Robin's last request varies by version. In some, he asks to be buried where his arrow falls, shooting one final shot from the window of his death chamber. In others, he requests burial in Sherwood Forest, beneath the greenwood he had called home. In all versions, there is a sense of completion, of a life lived according to principle, even when principle led to death. Another version has Robin killed in combat, not gloriously in open battle, but sordidly in an ambush, betrayed by someone he trusted, overwhelmed by numbers despite his legendary skill. This death is less poetic, but perhaps more realistic. Medieval outlaws rarely died peacefully in bed. More often they were killed by those they had wronged or by authorities they had defied. In this version, Robin Hood's death is a warning about the price of resistance. You can wound the system, embarrass it, defy it, but ultimately it will destroy you. A third tradition suggests Robin simply faded away, that he and his remaining men dispersed as they grew old, that the legend ended not with drama, but with dissolution. One day there were outlaws in Sherwood, and then there weren't, and no one could say exactly when the transition occurred. This version is perhaps truest to how most outlaws' careers actually ended. Not in memorable death, but in simple obsolescence. But regardless of which version we accept, the death of Robin Hood marked the end of an era. The Greenwood Kingdom that had existed in Sherwood Forest, that parallel power structure that had challenged Norman authority with Saxon resistance, that community of outlaws who had demonstrated that another way of life was possible, all of it passed into memory, and then into legend. The grave of Robin Hood, whether at Kirklees or in Sherwood, or simply in the collective imagination of England, became a site of pilgrimage. People would visit, kneel, remember the man who had dared to resist, who had chosen freedom over security, who had taken from the rich and given to the poor. Whether they were remembering a real man or a fictional hero mattered less than what that remembrance meant. Hope that resistance was possible. Belief that justice mattered more than law. Faith that somewhere, someone stood up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Little John, in the stories that followed Robin's death, did not long outlive his friend. Some versions have him dying of grief, unable to continue without the man who had been his brother in all but blood. Others show him returning to his original home, living out his days in quiet obscurity, the giant who had once been feared throughout the Midlands, becoming just another old man sitting by his fire, telling stories of his youth that listeners half believed. The other merry men scattered. Some accepted pardons and returned to normal life, though they were never quite normal again. Men who had lived in the greenwood, who had defied the Sheriff of Nottingham, who had ridden with Robin Hood, could not simply become farmers or craftsmen without some part of them always remaining in the forest. Others continued as outlaws, but without Robin's leadership and moral code, they became what society had always claimed they were. Bandits, thieves, men who took without giving, who robbed for profit rather than principle. The Sheriff of Nottingham, Whoever held that office when Robin died likely felt a satisfaction at his enemy's death. But it must have been a hollow victory. Robin Hood had never been defeated in direct confrontation. He had never been captured through superior strategy or force. He had simply grown old, grown tired, and died, as all men do. The sheriff had outlasted his opponent, but he had never outfought him, and everyone knew the difference. In the years immediately following Robin's death, Sherwood Forest felt different to those who travelled through it. The ancient oaks were unchanged. The paths and streams followed the same courses they had for centuries, but the greenwood seemed dimmed somehow, as if light had gone out of it. There were still outlaws in the forest. There always had been. There always would be. But they were not Robin's men, did not follow Robin's code, did not inspire the same mixture of fear and admiration. The common people mourned in their own ways. In taverns and around fires, they told stories of Robin Hood, stories that grew with each telling, that transformed the possible man into the certain legend. They sang ballads that preserved his deeds and his values, carrying his memory forward to generations who had never known him. They invoked his name when they saw injustice, as if calling on a saint rather than an outlaw, as if his spirit might still intervene on behalf of the oppressed. The church's relationship with Robin's memory was complicated. He had been an outlaw, a violator of law, a taker of property that belonged to others. But he had also been charitable, giving to the poor, defending the weak, maintaining his Christian faith even in outlawry. Some priests condemned his memory, preaching that law-breaking was always wrong, that Robin Hood had been a sinner who died unrepentant. Others quietly honored him, seeing in the outlaw a closer approximation to Christ's teachings than in many a bishop. The nobility tried to suppress Robin Hood's legend, understanding correctly that it was dangerous to the social order. A story that glorified a commoner who defied authority, who took property from the wealthy and redistributed it to the poor, who chose personal moral code over established law. Such a story was subversive, revolutionary, a threat to the hierarchical structure that kept nobles noble and peasants peasant. But legends cannot be suppressed by decree, and the more they tried to erase Robin Hood's memory, the more firmly it was established. The story of Robin Hood didn't end with his death. In many ways, it had only begun. Over the centuries that followed, the Outlaw of Sherwood would become one of the most enduring legends in English, indeed in world, literature, and culture. His transformation from possible historical figure to certain cultural icon reveals much about what different ages valued, feared, and dreamed. The earliest surviving written references to Robin Hood date from the 14th century, more than a century after he supposedly lived. The poem A Jest of Robin Hood, compiled around 1450 from earlier ballads, presents a Robin who is yeoman rather than noble, violent rather than gentle, concerned more with his own honour than with class warfare. This Robin is recognizably English, practical, loyal to his king, deeply religious, but also willing to use trickery and force to achieve his goals. These early ballads were not literature for the nobility, but entertainment for common people, sung at fairs, recited in taverns, passed from traveller to traveller. They presented Robin as one of the people, a commoner who achieved through skill what nobles achieved through birth. This Robin Hood was aspirational. He showed that common men could be heroes, that they could outwit their betters, that they could create their own codes of honor, independent of what society prescribed. As the centuries passed, each era reshaped Robin Hood according to its own needs and values. The 16th century, dealing with the upheaval of the Reformation, focused on Robin's conflicts with corrupt clergy, making him a proto-Protestant hero who opposed church wealth and hypocrisy. The fact that the original Robin had been Catholic was conveniently forgotten. He became a weapon in religious controversy, each side claiming him as their own. The 17th century, torn by civil war between king and parliament, saw different factions claim Robin for their cause. Royalists portrayed him as a loyal subject who fought corrupt officials but never challenged the crown, making him a symbol of proper hierarchy. Republicans made him a fighter against tyranny in all its forms, a man who valued freedom over authority. Both could not be right, but both found evidence for their interpretations in the malleable legend. The 18th century refined Robin into a gentleman, reflecting that era's obsession with class and propriety. Robin Hood became Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, a nobleman unjustly dispossessed who maintained his aristocratic values even while living as an outlaw. This transformation was partly about making Robin acceptable to middle-class readers who were increasingly his audience, and partly about containing the revolutionary implications of his story. A noble who temporarily lives as an outlaw but never questions the class system is far less threatening than a commoner who creates his own alternative society. Maid Marian appeared prominently in these later versions, barely present in the early ballads, but eventually becoming central to Robin's story. She represented domestication of the legend, adding romance and eventually marriage to what had been a tale of male adventure and resistance. Marian made Robin more accessible to female readers and allowed exploration of themes, love, loyalty, domesticity, that the earlier ballads had largely ignored. The Victorian era embraced Robin Hood with particular enthusiasm, seeing in him an embodiment of muscular Christianity and English national character. Howard Pyle's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, published in 1883, presented a Robin who was almost entirely admirable. Brave, generous, loyal, honourable, and always gentlemanly. The violence and moral ambiguity of the early ballads were sanded away, leaving a hero suitable for children's literature. This Victorian Robin emphasized his Saxonness, his resistance to Norman oppression, fitting the era's interest in ethnic nationalism and its construction of English identity. The Normans became villains, not just because they were powerful, but because they were foreign, and Robin's resistance became a story of English people defending their essential Englishness against continental influence. This interpretation, though historically questionable, proved enormously influential. The 20th century saw Robin Hood explode across new media. Silent films in the 1920s, sound films in the 1930s and beyond, television series, radio programs, each adaptation brought Robin to new audiences and added new elements to his legend. Errol Flynn's 1938 portrayal in The Adventures of Robin Hood became definitive for generations, his swashbuckling style and romantic storyline shaping how millions imagined the outlaw of Sherwood. Disney's 1973 animated version, presenting Robin and his companions as anthropomorphic animals, introduced the legend to children worldwide. Though seeming frivolous, it maintained the core of Robin's story: resistance to tyranny, generosity to the poor, triumph through cleverness and courage. The fact that Robin was a fox added a layer of trickster mythology, connecting him to older folk traditions of clever animals outwitting powerful predators. Kevin Costner's 1991 Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves updated the legend for contemporary audiences, adding a multicultural dimension with Morgan Freeman's character and emphasizing themes of friendship across cultural boundaries. Though historically absurd, Sherwood Forest does not look like Southern California, and Robin Hood didn't prevent witch burnings, the film kept the essential story alive for a new generation. The early 21st century brought grittier interpretations. Ridley Scott's 2010 film presented Robin as a soldier traumatized by war, exploring themes of PTSD and the cost of violence. The BBC's 2006 to 2009 series emphasized political intrigue and moral complexity, presenting a Robin who sometimes made questionable choices and whose resistance to tyranny was not always as clear-cut as legend suggested. Each interpretation revealed what its era valued and feared. Romantic versions flourished in times of peace, emphasizing love and adventure. Grittier versions emerged during or after wars, reflecting awareness of violence's true costs. Class-conscious versions appeared during periods of economic inequality, emphasizing redistribution of wealth. Nationalistic versions arose during threats to English identity, emphasizing Saxon resistance to foreign domination. But through all these transformations, certain core elements remained constant. Robin Hood robs the rich and gives to the poor. He lives in the forest outside societal norms. He is an exceptional archer. He leads a band of companions. He opposes corrupt authority while claiming loyalty to legitimate authority. He chooses freedom over security, principle over profit, resistance over submission. These constants reveal the legend's enduring power. Robin Hood represents the dream that resistance is possible, that individuals can challenge systems, that justice can exist outside law, that freedom can be preserved even when it must hide in the forest. He is the eternal fantasy of the oppressed, that somewhere someone is fighting back, that the powerful are not invincible, that courage and skill can triumph over wealth and position. The geographical reality of Sherwood Forest has changed dramatically since Robin Hood's supposed time. The vast woodland that once covered much of Nottinghamshire has been reduced to scattered remnants, preserved parks that are shadows of the ancient forest. Yet these remnants draw hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, people who come to walk where Robin supposedly walked, to stand beneath the major oak, to imagine a time when the greenwood was refuge and rebellion was possible. The debates over Robin Hood's historicity continue among scholars. Some argue for specific historical figures who might have inspired the legend. Robert Hood, an outlaw mentioned in the 1230s court records, Robert Folliot, a rebel against King John, Roger Godbird, a 13th-century bandit. Others contend that Robin Hood is entirely mythical, a folk hero created from whole cloth to embody popular hopes and resentments. But this debate, while historically interesting, misses the point of legend. Whether Robin Hood was a real person matters less than what he has meant to 8 centuries of people who needed to believe he was real. He was real to the medieval peasants who sang his ballads. He was real to the 16th century Protestants who made him their symbol. He was real to the Victorian children who read of his adventures. He is real to modern audiences who watch his films and visit his forest. In our own time, Robin Hood remains relevant in ways that might have surprised earlier generations. When economic inequality reaches levels not seen since the Middle Ages, when the wealthy seem to play by different rules than the rest of us, when systems appear rigged in favor of those who already have power, in such times, the story of a man who robbed the rich and gave to the poor resonates with particular force. Occupy Wall Street protesters invoked Robin Hood, calling for a Robin Hood tax on financial transactions. Climate activists occupying forests to prevent development claim his legacy. Labor organizers fighting for fair wages appeal to his example. Political movements across the spectrum claim him. Progressive redistributionists and libertarian anti-authoritarians, English nationalists and universal humanists. All find something in Robin Hood that speaks to their cause. This universality is both the legend's strength and its limitation. A story that can mean everything risks meaning nothing. A hero everyone claims cannot truly challenge anyone. Robin Hood has been so thoroughly absorbed into mainstream culture that his revolutionary implications are often domesticated, his resistance to authority rendered safe and acceptable. Yet the core of the legend remains dangerous to any established order. The idea that law and justice are not always the same thing, that individuals can and should resist unjust authority, that property rights are less sacred than human needs. These principles, embedded in every version of the Robin Hood story, are fundamentally subversive. They suggest that when systems fail to provide justice, people have the right to create their own justice, even if that means breaking laws those systems have established. The Outlaw of Sherwood has become a permanent resident of the human imagination, a figure who will be reinterpreted by every generation according to its needs, but who will always represent certain unchanging values. He is the champion of the powerless, the voice of the voiceless, the reminder that tyranny can be resisted and that freedom, though it may retreat to the forest, never entirely dies. In the 21st century, as in the 12th, people face powerful systems that seem indifferent to their struggles. Modern Sherwood forests may be different: corporate structures, political machines, economic systems. But the need for a Robin Hood remains. Someone who stands outside the system and says it is wrong. Someone who acts according to conscience rather than law. Someone who takes from those who have too much and gives to those who have nothing. Will such a figure emerge, or have modern surveillance and social control made true outlawry impossible? These questions haunt our age as they haunted previous ones, but the legend of Robin Hood suggests that resistance is always possible, that the human spirit always finds ways to assert freedom, that somewhere, in some metaphorical Sherwood, the arrow is always flying toward the target, the horn is always sounding the call to gather, the men in Lincoln Green are always robbing the rich to give to the poor. 800 years after Robin Hood supposedly lived, we stand at the edge of a different kind of forest, Not the literal woodland of oak and ash, but the metaphorical wilderness where law ends and conscience begins, where systems break down and individuals must choose who they will be. The questions Robin Hood's legend raises remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. When does law become tyranny? When does obedience become complicity? When does resistance become duty? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles, but practical challenges that every generation must face anew. Robin Hood offers no simple answers. He is not a model for perfect resistance. His methods were violent. His justifications were sometimes questionable. His effectiveness was limited. He changed nothing fundamental about medieval English society. The Norman nobility remained in power. The forest law remained harsh. The poor remained poor. If we judge him by tangible achievements, he was a failure. But legends are not preserved because of tangible achievements. They endure because of intangible meanings, hope, inspiration, the demonstration that resistance is possible even when victory is not. Robin Hood showed that individuals could defy systems, that the powerful could be challenged, that freedom could exist even if only in the spaces between law's reach. The greenwood remains, both as physical remnant in Nottinghamshire and as eternal refuge in imagination. It stands as symbol and promise that there is always somewhere to go when systems become unbearable, that there is always another way to live. That freedom, though it may require sacrifice, is always available to those brave enough to claim it. As night falls over England, as it has for countless centuries since Robin Hood supposedly walked beneath Sherwood's branches, the legend endures. In stories told and retold, in films watched and rewatched, in the hearts of all who dream of a more just world, the outlaw archer draws his bow once more. The arrow flies true, the horn sounds in the greenwood, and somewhere in the eternal present of legend, it is always spring in Sherwood Forest, and Robin Hood and his merry men are always free. The man may never have existed, but the hope he represents is immortal. The justice he sought remains elusive, but the struggle for it continues. The greenwood has mostly vanished, but its shadow falls across every age, reminding us that freedom is worth fighting for, that justice matters more than law, that some truths are too important to be forgotten, no matter how many centuries pass. This is the legend of Robin Hood, outlaw of Sherwood, champion of the poor, defier of tyranny. May his arrows always fly true. May his horn always call the faithful. May his greenwood always offer refuge to those who seek freedom. May his legend inspire resistance in every age that needs reminding, that power is not absolute, that authority is not infallible, that somewhere, always, the people have a champion. And so we leave the mist-shrouded forests of Sherwood, the legend complete yet never-ending, the story told yet always being retold. Sleep well, dear listeners, and dream of greenwood freedom, of arrows flying true, of a world where justice prevails and the poor have a champion. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, where legends wait to be rediscovered and heroes wait to be remembered. Good night from the greenwood deep.